Chapter 12 is the second chapter in the cardiovascular system and focuses on the heart. In this lecture, we'll describe the anatomy of the heart, including the blood supply and pericardium structure, and trace the flow of blood through the heart, identifying the major blood vessels, chambers, and heart valves. We'll explain the events of an action potential in cardiac muscle. We'll describe the conducting system of the heart and identify the electrical events recorded in a normal ECG. Then we'll explain the events of the cardiac cycle and relate the heart sounds to specific events in this cycle. Last, we'll define cardiac output, describe the factors that influence heart rate and stroke volume, and explain how adjustments in stroke volume and cardiac output are coordinated at different levels of physical activity. All cardiovascular functions rely on the heart continually moving blood. Without constant movement of blood, the oxygen and nutrients would quickly be depleted, waste would quickly accumulate in the tissue, and white blood cells and hormones could not reach their targets. The heart beats approximately 100,000 times a day, pumping roughly 8,000 liters of blood. The heart pumps blood through a network of vessels that extend between the heart and peripheral tissues. The vessels are divided into two groups, the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. The pulmonary circuit carries blood to and from the lungs, and the systemic circuit transports blood to and from the rest of the body. Vessels are described by the direction of the blood they carry in reference to the heart. Arteries carry blood away from the heart chambers. Veins return blood to the heart. Capillaries are thin-walled vessels between arteries and veins. These thin walls of the capillaries permit the exchange of nutrients, gases, and wastes between the blood and tissues. The heart contains 4 muscular chambers, 2 associated with each circuit. The right atrium receives blood from the systemic circuit. The right ventricle pumps blood into the pulmonary circuit. The left atrium receives blood from the pulmonary circuit, and the left ventricle pumps blood into the systemic circuit. The heart is located in the thoracic cavity, in the mediastinum behind the sternum, and between the two lungs. The mediastinum is pictured here in this transverse section in yellow. The heart is surrounded by a pericardial cavity, which is lined by serous membrane, the pericardium. The visceral pericardium, or the epicardium, covers the heart, and the parietal pericardium lines the inner surface of the pericardial sac. Pericardial fluid is found between the layers and is there to reduce the friction as the heart beats. Now let's take a look at some of the surface anatomy of the heart. The atria have thin walls that can collapse, when they're empty, into a flap called the auricle. There is a left atrium and a right atrium. On the anterior view, the right atrium is pictured in blue, and on the posterior aspect, you can see the left atrium pictured as a red area. Next, the coronary sulcus marks the border between the atria and the ventricles. It's a deep groove filled with fat. The anterior and posterior interventricular sulci mark the boundaries between the left and the right ventricles. The superior end of the heart is called the base. It has the great vessels, the aorta, vena cava, pulmonary arteries, and pulmonary veins. The inferior end of the heart is called the apex. It's the pointed tip. Let's look deeper at the wall of the heart, which contains 3 distinct layers. The outer surface of the heart is covered by the epicardium, which, like all membranes, is composed of an epithelial layer and a connective tissue layer, the areolar tissue. Next, the myocardium in the middle contains the cardiac muscle cells. These form bands that wrap and spiral to produce a twisting and squeezing action during contraction. The inside of the heart is covered with endocardium. And this covers the inside of the chambers and the heart valves. And again, like all membranes, the endocardium has the endothelial layer and the connective tissue layer, the areolar tissue. Cardiac muscle cells are smaller than typical skeletal muscle cells. They contain a single nucleus, and the myofibrils are organized into sarcomeres and contain a large amount of mitochondria, very similar to skeletal muscle cells. Something unique, cardiac muscle cells are joined at intercalated discs. These cells are linked by these intercalated discs that have desmosomes and gap junctions. This is going to increase efficiency during a contraction. Additionally, there's a lot of collagen and elastin fibers wrapped around the muscle cells. They provide support for muscles, vessels, and nerves. They add strength by preventing overexpansion of the heart, and they help the heart return to a normal at-rest shape after contractions. Also, these connective tissues will form the cardiac skeleton of the heart, which I'll discuss soon. Now let's look at the internal anatomy of the heart. Labeled here are the atriums, and you can see the space that they create. But in between them, we also have this wall that separates the two atria called the interatrial septum. The interventricular septum separates the two ventricles. Notice that the right ventricle has a thinner myocardium and wall. This is because the right ventricle is a much lower pressured system. Compare that to the left ventricle with a very thick myocardium and wall. The left ventricle produces 4 to 6 times more pressure than the right ventricle. And again, remember that when the heart contracts, it contracts in a squeezing, twisting motion. Next, the atrioventricular valves, which are abbreviated AV, atrioventricular. The atrioventricular valves allow blood to flow one way from atrium to ventricle on the same side. When the ventricles contract, the cusps of the valves are pushed closed. Chordae tendineae and tension in the papillary muscles prevent backflow or regurgitation into the atria. The right AV valve is also called the tricuspid valve. This has 3 flaps or cusps. The right AV valve is opening between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and the cusps are braced by fibers called chordae tendineae that are connected to the papillary muscles, labeled here on this picture. The combination of papillary muscles and chordae tendineae is going to limit the cusp movement and prevent backflow into the atrium. So the cusp never flaps into the atrium, only opens down into the ventricle. The left AV valve is also called the bicuspid valve. It has only 2 flaps or cusps, and it also has chordae tendineae and papillary muscles that will prevent it from flapping back into the atrium. Trabeculae carneae are muscular ridges on the inner surface of both of the ventricles. The semilunar valves prevent backflow from the pulmonary trunk and ascending aorta into the ventricles. Labeled in this picture, we have the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, as well as the coronary sinus, which all return blood to the right atrium. Notice the fossa ovalis, also called the foramen ovale, is a small depression in the interatrial septum. This is open during fetal development and allows the blood to circulate from right atrium to left atrium. At birth, this foramen ovale will close. And those are some of the highlights of the internal structures of the heart. Now let's talk about the two circuits, starting with the pulmonary circuit. In the pulmonary circuit, blood will leave the right ventricle of the heart and flow through the pulmonary semilunar valve. It then enters the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk branches into the right and left pulmonary arteries. The blood will then reach the pulmonary capillaries where gas exchange will occur inside of the lungs. The blood that is now oxygen-rich will enter the right and left pulmonary veins and flow back to the heart into the left atrium. In the systemic circuit, blood leaves the left ventricle and will pass through the aortic semilunar valve, entering into the ascending aorta and the aortic arch. From there, the blood can flow into the descending aorta and numerous different branches to capillary beds in the tissues. The now oxygen-poor blood will be drained by the inferior or superior vena cava and the coronary sinus. These vessels bring the blood back to the right atrium of the heart. I mentioned the cardiac skeleton, and this is a fibrous elastic tissue structure in the heart that encircles the bases of the large vessels that are leaving the heart. It also encircles each of the heart valves. The idea of this dense elastic tissue is to stabilize the valves and the vessels. It's also going to be important because it physically isolates the atrial muscles from the ventricular muscles. The cardiac skeleton is important for the normal timing of the cardiac contraction because this is what those cardiac muscles are anchored to. Since the heart works continuously, cardiac muscle cells require a reliable source of oxygen and nutrients, and the coronary circulation supplies the blood to the muscle tissue of the heart. So let's take a look at those vessels. The left and the right coronary arteries originate at the base of the aorta and at the aortic sinuses. The right coronary supplies blood to the right atrium and to portions of both ventricles. The left coronary artery supplies the left ventricle, the left atrium, and the interventricular septum. The right coronary artery branches into the marginal and posterior interventricular arteries. The left coronary artery forms the circumflex and the anterior interventricular arteries. Small tributaries from these branches of the left and right coronary arteries form interconnections called anastomoses. The great and middle cardiac veins carry blood away from the coronary capillaries and drain into the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus opens directly into the right atrium. And those are the coronary arteries and veins. We've reached the end of this particular recording and lecture, and before I let you work on your checkpoint questions here, I just wanted to show you this video. If it will load.
The lungs, the heart, and their blood vessels are located in the thoracic cavity. The heart functions as two side-by-side pumps, each with valves that maintain one-way blood flow. The right side of the heart, composed of the right atrium and right ventricle, receives oxygen-poor blood from the body and sends it to the lungs to be reoxygenated. The left side of the formed by the left ventricle and left atrium. It receives the reoxygenated blood from the lungs and directs it into the systemic circulation for distribution to the body. Venous blood from the systemic circulation returns to the heart by entering the right atrium via the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava. Blood from the muscular walls of the heart also enters the right atrium via the coronary sinus. The right atrium is distinct in that its anterior and posterior walls are different. While the posterior wall is smooth, its anterior wall has ridges formed by pectinate muscles and has an outpouching called the auricle. Blood moves from the right atrium into the right ventricle. These two chambers are separated by the right atrioventricular valve, which is also known as the tricuspid valve. Movement of the three flaps of the right atrioventricular valve is controlled by chordae tendineae and their papillary muscles. The rough walls of the right ventricle are created by muscular trabeculae carneae. Contraction of the right ventricle causes blood to push open the semilunar cusps of the pulmonary valve and enter the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk divides into right and left pulmonary arteries for distribution to the lungs for oxygenation. Pulmonary veins return oxygen-rich blood to the left atrium. The wall of the left atrium is smooth and, like the right atrium, has an auricle. Blood moves from the left atrium into the left ventricle. These two chambers are separated by the left atrioventricular valve, which is also called the bicuspid or mitral valve. Movement of the two flaps of the left atrioventricular valve, like the right atrioventricular valve, is controlled by chordae tendineae and their papillary muscles. The semilunar cusps of the aortic valve control the opening to the ascending aorta. Contraction of the left ventricle causes blood to push open the cusps of the aortic valve. Blood then enters the ascending part of the aorta. Branches of the aorta distribute oxygenated blood to the heart and body. The combination of strong muscular walls, one-way valves, and a precisely timed sequence of contraction allow the heart to support the delivery of blood to the entire body.